Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. I would ask everyone to check one last time that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin. I will also alert a few in the room. Don't get too panicked. There is some construction going on next to us, so you may hear something throughout. But don't worry about it. We're safe and sound up here on the 7th floor. We, of course, welcome questions from our internet viewers at any time. You can simply email us at speaker@heritage.org. We're pleased that our C-SPAN audience will also be joining us today and look forward to a wonderful question and answer session throughout our programming. Hosting our discussion this afternoon is Stephen Bucci. Dr. Bucci is director of our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign and National Security Policy. He served for 3 decades as an Army Special Forces officer and top Pentagon official. He is well versed in special operations and cybersecurity as well as defense support for civilian authorities. He served as a military assistant to Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld for 5.5 years, and upon retirement from the Army, he continued at the Pentagon as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and American Security Affairs. He has also been a consultant with IBM on cybersecurity prior to joining us here at Heritage. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Steve Bucci. Steve?
Now let me add my welcome to everyone. I think we have a good program for you this morning, and hopefully we'll all come out of this a little better informed than when we got here. The program is going to go as follows. I will introduce Secretary Chertoff. Then he will speak, answer a few questions, then he has to depart, and we'll bring the panel up. I'll introduce them. We'll do the panel piece of it, and then finally we will wrap up with closing remarks by the ambassador. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Secretary Michael Chertoff. He is the executive chairman and co-founder of the Chertoff Group. Probably even more significantly, he was the secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Took that job at a very difficult time and frankly sort of remade the organization and brought it up to a status where it was extremely effective. And I say that as having been the Department of Defense counterpart to DHS during my time as a deputy assistant. I had the opportunity to work extensively with Secretary Chertoff's folks on quite a few rather interesting events, both natural and man-made. He is also a former federal judge for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit and was a federal prosecutor who, among other things, conducted the investigation of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And with that, I will ask Secretary Chertoff to join us.
Thank you, Steve, and it's good to see some familiar faces in the crowd, including some veterans of the government during my tenure. Well, one of the things I did when I was Secretary of Homeland Security is I was engaged in the process of expanding the Visa Waiver Program, which in 2007-2008 expanded to incorporate a number of nations in Central Europe. And in 2008, I actually had the opportunity to go around and meet with the leaders of those countries. And it was a remarkable experience. In fact, in many ways, one of the highlights of my professional tenure, at the department, because I was made aware of how meaningful that inclusion into the Visa Waiver Program was to the citizens of those countries of Central Europe. Time and again, I was told, whether it was the Baltics or the Czech Republic or Slovakia, that the inclusion of these countries in the Visa Waiver Program was the final step in recognizing their migration from being under the control of the former Soviet Union into becoming full members of the Association of Freedom-Loving and Democratic States. So it was not just an economic or travel issue, but it was a moral and political issue for these countries. And by the way, if you ever want to experience real gratitude, it's to go to a country which has been admitted into the program and to see how even everyday people react to being told that they're finally in the category equivalent to that of Western European allies that we have had within the program for a long period of time. In fact, even my barber here in the U.S., who was from Korea, made a point of saying the next time I went in to get my hair cut, thank you very much for admitting Korea to the Visa Waiver Program. So it was very, very meaningful. But I'm here to talk about the program not in light of my experience in 2008, but in light of where we are now. And obviously we are in a dangerous place in the world, perhaps more dangerous than at any time in the last 10 years. That's to say, past a couple of years after the events of 9/11. And that's frankly because of the proliferation of terrorist groups, really ranging from parts of Africa all the way east into Afghanistan and Pakistan. And a notable element of what we've seen in the last year or so has been the rise of groups like ISIS in Syria and Iraq that deliberately recruit foreign fighters, Westerners, Americans and Europeans, in order to have them not only train and participate in terrorist activities in the Middle East or in Africa, but also to prepare people who may come back to the United States or Western Europe at some point and carry out attacks in those locations. In fact, just recently, we learned that the individual who attacked a Jewish facility in Belgium was a Frenchman who had actually gone and engaged in activities with ISIS in Syria and Iraq before he went back to Western Europe. This has obviously raised, again, the question of the security of travel and the security we have with respect to visitors, and put it on the front burner. And I know that some have suggested that maybe we need to revisit the Visa Waiver Program. And I'm here to say that I think that would be a huge mistake. I think it would be the equivalent of trying to conduct an operation that requires a scalpel by using a chainsaw. All that happens is you don't achieve your mission and you wind up killing the patient as well. I think there are things we can do to enhance our security, but I actually think within the Visa Waiver Program, we can be more effective in doing that. So I want to take a few minutes to lay out what I see as the benefits to the United States of having a vigorous and effective Visa Waiver Program, and then talk about a few of the things we might do to make sure that we can continue to protect ourselves even within the framework of that program. First, it needs to be clear that the Visa Waiver Program is not a program that allows anybody willy-nilly to come into the United States, whether or not they pose a risk. When we inaugurated the expansion of the program several years ago, we added an element called ESTA, the Electronic System of Travel Authorization. And this is a very simple and straightforward process that requires Visa Waiver Program participants, both the new entrant countries and the old existing members of the program, requires their citizens periodically to file online with the U.S. government a brief statement about their particulars, the kinds of things we normally collect at the border itself, but to do so in advance. And what that does is it creates an opportunity for our government to look at the details of someone's birth date, address, things of that sort, and determine whether, based on what our intelligence is, this person poses perhaps a risk that requires a closer look at the time that they arrive in the United States. So it is a very unobtrusive and convenient way to collect information in advance that we used to collect only when someone arrived in the U.S. And that gives us the opportunity to analyze that kind of basic data so that we can determine whether people are maybe red flagged for purposes of further inquiry. Added to that, we have the capabilities now through our ability to review and analyze passenger name record information, which is basic travel data about people's address, contact information, and travel route. By combining this with ESTA, we're able again to take a deeper look at the kinds of connections or contacts that might suggest someone is a risk that we can then pull into secondary when they arrive in the United States. These programs have proven very powerful over the years in allowing us to avoid the problem of people coming in as operatives from overseas because we have an early warning, and that applies with respect to Western Europeans as well as those from other parts of the world. Now, there are some other benefits that we get from the Visa Waiver Program that are maybe a little bit more broad than simply our better visibility into who's coming into the country. And one of them is the increasing solidarity that the program gives us with countries in Europe and particularly in Central Europe. It will not have escaped your notice that we're at a time now, maybe again for the first time in many, many years, that there is a serious national security issue on the European continent. And of course, I'm talking about what's going on in Ukraine and the various threatening noises that have been made from time to time from Mr. Putin with respect to the Baltics and Central Europe. From a strategic standpoint, it would be a national security problem of the first order if the countries of Central Europe and the Baltics began to feel that they were being isolated and cut loose from the West at the very time that Russia is making noises about expanding its sphere of influence and its sphere of power. One of the things the Visa Waiver Program allows us to do with these countries is to reaffirm our solidarity and our belief that the new democracies of Europe are every bit a part of the Western enterprise as the familiar democracies such as England, France, and Germany. And I think maintaining that sense of solidarity, particularly at this moment, is of critical importance to American and indeed to the whole NATO national security alliance. Finally, there's of course economic benefit. The ability for Central Europeans and Koreans and others to travel to the U.S. and for us to travel to their countries without the need to get a visa and go through a cumbersome process facilitates trade, economic activity, and even cultural exchange. And particularly at a time that the global economic climate remains fragile and recovery is uneven, to say the least, promoting economic development has a positive benefit for this country as well as for the countries that we travel to or that have citizens that travel to us. Now, what do we say in light of these new threats with respect to foreign fighters? Well, of course, one point to be made is that obviously with respect to Americans who go to Iraq and Syria to fight with ISIS or who went to Somalia to fight with al-Shabaab, that's not a visa waiver issue because these are American citizens who are entitled to come back into the U.S. and they don't need a visa under any circumstances. What we need to do to identify these returning fighters, and the same principle applies to fighters who are coming via perhaps Western European countries and then traveling into the U.S. What we need to do is to have a judicious and analytically sound collection of information about travelers that allow us to identify patterns of behavior and connections that suggest we need to take a closer look. That may be, for example, email contacts that turn up connected to emails of terrorists. It may turn out to be telephone contact numbers that we've previously identified as associated with terrorist groups. It may be behavior in terms of travel patterns that suggests someone has gone perhaps to the Middle East, been there for several months, and then emerges and we don't have a clear picture of where they were. That's not to say that that is necessarily proof of guilt, but it is proof that you need to look a little bit more closely. And the ability to use programs like ESTA as a way of collecting that information, the ability to use what we've been doing with respect to passenger name record information as a way of identifying patterns that require a closer look. This is exactly the kind of scalpel that we need to use in order to identify those who might be a risk in terms of terrorist activity and to then take a closer look at them. Just to give you an idea of how effective this kind of thing can be, we looked back at the 9/11 hijackers after we had put this program into effect. And we wanted to see if we had the current programs we have in place prior to September 2001, whether we would have picked up connections among the 19 hijackers. And when we ran the current programs retrospectively, we discovered that 15 of the 19 hijackers we would have found connections among. And we would have found some of those connections then taking us back to individuals who we knew and had identified as al-Qaeda operatives or supporters. So we have really validated this concept and it has served us well, and I submit to you it can continue to serve us well even while we maintain the Visa Waiver Program going forward. Finally, I think there are a couple of other things we can do. One is we have begun to expand preclearance overseas. We have preclearance in Shannon in Ireland. I know that the Department of Homeland Security is looking at preclearance in other areas. Now, to explain what preclearance is it's a program where, with agreement of a country overseas, we're able to place our Customs and Border Protection officials in an overseas airport. And effectively, they conduct immigration and customs before people board the plane. Now, that's a convenience to the people who come to the U.S. because they no longer have to come through a gateway that has a customs presence in the U.S. They can travel directly to other cities. But it's a benefit to us, excuse me, because we get, again, an early look at the people coming into the United States. We get not only to look at the paper record and whatever we're able to collect using ESTA and PNR, but we're able to have trained officers look face-to-face and examine the people who want to come into the U.S. to determine whether their behavior suggests questionable activity. That is an extra level of protection for us. It is also a convenience for the traveler, because if you have a traveler that may exhibit a problem, we can catch it before the person gets on the airplane, and that creates an extra level of security with respect to aviation security. So preclearance is a win-win-win for the U.S. government, for the traveling public that's on the airplane, and for the country that is hosting our preclearance program. A second thing we can do, excuse me, in order to make sure that we get the full benefit of what our current protective programs are with respect to visa waiver, is to continue to support what is being done in our intelligence community to collect information about telephone numbers and email addresses overseas that are potentially connected to dangerous terrorists. You don't need to look at the content to recognize that when you have a particular IP address or a particular phone number that you have previously seen related to terrorist financing activity or even operational activity, that anybody who connects with that number, you need to take a closer look at. Could there be an innocent reason to connect to it? Yeah, there could be. But at the very least, it puts you on notice that you ought to be asking more questions. And one of the things I try to say when the subject comes up about how do we deal with ISIS and the increased risk of foreign fighters is, this is not the time to handicap or dismantle our intelligence collection programs using NSA and other intelligence agencies that have been literally the cornerstone of protecting the United States since 2001. It has made it much more difficult for the enemy. It has yielded concrete results. And at a time that we need this more than ever because of what's going on out there, we do not want to reduce our capability in this area. So in conclusion, I'll take a couple minutes of questions. I think the Visa Waiver Program is a plus for our national security and for our economic security. I think that we have constructed a program that makes it a reduction of the vulnerability very powerful. There are some additional things we can do and are doing to even enhance our ability to protect ourselves. And the way to deal with the issue of foreign fighters is to use the scalpel of identifying them with precision and taking them out, and not the chainsaw of dismantling a program that has served not only the United States well, but our foreign friends and allies overseas. So with that, if you identify yourself, I'm happy to take 2 or 3 questions. Yes.
It's Penny Starr with CNS News. Thank you for speaking here today. What else is there that they look at that can help identify the bad guys, for lack of a better word, than emails and phone numbers? Is there any other data that this program allows the government to look at? Thank you.
Yes. Now, I'm not going to get here and tell you all the stuff that's looked at. I'd be pretty silly if I did that. So the answer is yes. But it's all completely legal and legitimate. Yes.
Tom Curry with the CQ Roll Call. Mr. Secretary, you mentioned the value in the preclearance program of looking at the person face-to-face. Go back to the visa process. What purpose, if any, does the traditional interview to get a visa serve in a counterterrorism role, and is that the value of that face-to-face interview lost? Because not everybody goes through this
Correct.
preclearance process. Many visa waiver arrivals do not. So what value, if any, does the traditional visa interview have in counterterrorism?
Well, the interview is supposed to actually look at a number of different things. I mean, it obviously has value in terms of counterterrorism, but it actually arose in a different context. What it was designed to do was to detect people who might come to the U.S. and overstay and not leave. And it was, a lot of it was focused on, what are your roots back home, what's your reason for coming, things of that sort. Often what happens is people show a kind of an evasiveness or nervousness. It doesn't tell you exactly what threat they pose, but it tells you that there's something you need to look at more closely. So there's no question that the visa interview adds a certain dimension, but on balance, in the end, it doesn't really give you the kind of granularity that you get with the data and the data analytics, which have really far advanced over where we were 12, 13, 14 years ago. So again, if I look at the trade-off, the positive benefit of the program and the marginal issue in terms of protection, I think the marginal cost is very small and easily compensated for, and the benefit remains very powerful. I'll take two more, and then I'm going to have to.
Thank you. Brad Clapper from Associated Press. When you see efforts in Congress right now, some Democrats, some Republicans have even signed on to these, to suspend the Visa Waiver Program, how do you go about talking to them about that beyond what you said today? I mean, would you even be able to fathom suspending something that's letting millions of people in, I think 3.8 million Brits last year? Do we have staff that could do the type of work that would replace ESTA? If we don't, how long would that take to establish? How much money are we talking about here? So could you go over some of those alternatives,
I think
however bleak they may be? Thanks.
I think you've actually laid out some of the problems. I mean, if you try to visualize what the consequences of terminating this program would be, it's hard to calculate what the cost is. First, as you point out, there'd be an immediate drop-off of travel, both to the U.S. and from the U.S. That would not only affect tourism, it would affect economic activity. People going over to conduct business or to sell products. All those people would wind up having to go into the visa process. As you observe, quite rightly, we'd have to staff up tremendously in terms of putting people overseas in order to manage the demand for visas, assuming people wanted to go through that process. That would have a serious impact on the federal budget. If you didn't do that, we'd be shooting a torpedo right amidships our tourist industry and our economy. And I think under any circumstances, I'm confident you'd see a measurable impact on the global economy and the U.S. economy almost instantly. We would irritate our friends and allies who we go to for help. For example, when we put together a coalition, as we have in Iraq and Syria, and we would really give a boost to Mr. Putin, who would turn to the Central Europeans and the Baltics and say, you see, they told you that you were friends of theirs, but the West pitches you over the side at the first sign of trouble. I would say that you almost can't calculate the cost in our national security and the cost in our economic benefit and our federal budget in terminating this program. I think one more and then.
Paul Marengoff, Powerline. Your question, your answer regarding the face-to-face interview and the importance of that makes me think that perhaps we would be best off making the continuance of the program for a particular country contingent upon them implementing the preclearance within a reasonable period of time, so that we would be sure we had the face-to-face interview on an ongoing basis.
Well, preclearance, as I say, it can be a useful addition, not We don't have the money, frankly, and the capability to really go into preclearance in all the visa waiver countries. I mean, that, again, for people who worry about the budget, there's a limit to how much money you have to spend to put people overseas and maintain them. And again, while that face-to-face element is a useful element, it is by no means essential. The most important tools you have are the tools of intelligence collection and analysis. I mean, if you get a nervous person, that face-to-face is helpful. But again, if you're looking at the marginal benefit versus the marginal cost, I think the cost of doing it for every visa waiver country is far exceeding the benefit.
Thank you.
Okay.
Join me in thanking the Secretary. Okay, I'd ask the panelists to come forward. I think Secretary Chertoff has done a great job of establishing the issues that we're attempting to deal with here this morning. I guess it's afternoon now, sorry. We have a lot of well-meaning people over on Capitol Hill and some commentators who are opining that perhaps the Visa Waiver Program needs to be terminated, suspended, something like that, and that was the genesis of doing this event. We now have a panel, or two of the three panelists. The third one will arrive here shortly. I'd like to introduce them and then get them started, and then you'll notice when the third panelist pops up, he's kind of a big personality. So we're going to start with my colleague, David and Sarah, who is a research associate specifically tasked with doing all of the homeland security issues for Heritage. He specializes in cyber and immigration issues, but he's responsible for all of it. He works for me, and he gets to do all the work. I get to take the bows. He will be followed by Adam Sachs. Adam is the founder of and president of Tourism Economics, which is dedicated to analytically based consulting for the tourism sector. He is an expert and a consultant dealing with hard numbers on the costs and benefits, and in some cases liabilities, of certain programs and how they affect a very large economic sector to us, which is the tourism sector. And then the missing third panelist is Stuart Baker. Stuart is a partner with Steptoe and Johnson, but he was the first Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security for Policy, and he's the guy who set most of these programs up there under Secretary Chertoff, and is a leading commentator on many of these issues. And for those of you that know Stuart, I noticed a few laughs when I mentioned the size of his personality. He is a very outspoken person about whatever he chooses to speak about. So we'll do the same thing. Each of the speakers will go for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll go through all three of them and then take questions at the end of that. I will moderate that part. We want to try and get as many questions as we can, so if you ask short ones with an actual question mark at the end of them, that's good. And we'll get through as many as possible and then go to our final speaker. So with that, we'll start with David.
Thanks, Steve. So what I want to do today is just really quickly describe what the Visa Waiver Program is, describe some of the benefits that were laid out before by Secretary Chertoff, deal with some of the concerns, and then discuss what are the next steps forward for this program. So first, what is VWP? The Visa Waiver Program allows residents from member countries to visit the United States without a visa for up to 90 days for business or pleasure. To be a part of VWP, a country must meet several criteria. First, a country must have a non-immigrant refusal rate of less than 3%. A visa refusal rate is simply the percentage of visa applications that are denied by the State Department for any particular country. Second, it must issue its citizens secure, machine-readable, and biometric passports. And third, the country must represent no discernible security or law enforcement risk to the United States. Currently, there are 38 countries that are participating in Visa Waiver, with Chile being the most recent to join just earlier this year. As required by Visa Waiver Program and other laws that amended it, these nations have agreed to other stipulations and obligations to join VWP. They must share intelligence with us on known and suspected terrorists. They have to exchange biometric, biographic information about criminals that could be coming to the United States. They have to share information on lost and stolen passports. They have to increase their own airport security requirements. And they have to provide U.S. citizens with a reciprocal ability to travel to that country without a visa as well. Now, these features greatly enhance the security by providing U.S. law enforcement and security agencies with more information and more intelligence on potential terrorists and other bad actors. The Visa Waiver Program makes it easier for U.S. officials to know whether an individual presents a security threat. The Visa Waiver Program also allows the State Department to focus its limited consular resources on those countries and individuals about which less is known and who could be higher risks to the United States. Furthermore, the Visa Waiver Program is not without screening and security procedures. As Secretary Chertoff mentioned, every traveler from the U.S. Coming to the U.S. from a Visa Waiver Program country must be pre-screened through ESTA, which checks various databases and does the sort of data analytics which Secretary Chertoff mentioned. And it checks to make sure that they are not a security risk and that they are eligible for entry into the United States. Additionally, at every step along the process, from buying a ticket to checking in for their flight, to showing up at the gate, to landing in the United States, there are a series of checks that are going based on the most updated information that we have in our systems. At any point along that process, if a U.S. official believes that there's a security risk, they can dive in deeper, take a deeper look, and if necessary, deny the person entry into the United States. So in terms of benefits, clearly the first is security. More information sharing, better airport security abroad, and being able to focus our finite consular resources on higher risk countries and individuals. These all improve U.S. security. Second, the U.S. has had and continues to have major economic benefits. VWP makes trade and tourism easier and brings individuals to the United States where they can spend their money here, and also enables businessmen to come here and engage in business transactions. Adam will clearly be talking more about that since he's the expert on that. And lastly, VWP is an important tool for foreign policy and public diplomacy. Allowing individuals to come to the United States and enjoy our country can improve foreign public's understanding of America and our culture. By extending the privilege of VWP to other nations, we also deepen the diplomatic ties that we have with friendly governments as well. Now, with these major benefits, we should address some of the concerns, specifically the threat of ISIS, European passport holders becoming foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. Making the issue worse, in 2012, there was a GAO study that found that a lot of the information sharing wasn't occurring. Certainly, this is a valid reason for concern. If the VWP is premised on increasing information sharing and the information sharing isn't happening, that's bad. In 2012, Heritage wrote that it was time to hold these countries accountable if they do not share their information. Well, since then, the information sharing has increased dramatically. The CRS did a study just earlier this year and found that nearly all countries were sharing nearly all the data they had that was required under the law. More recent conversations that I've had with DHS officials point to the fact that all countries are sharing all information, and now it's just a question of working out some of the particulars about the data automation piece and how the information is actually being shared, but it is occurring. Now, while radicalized Britons or Germans or anyone from Europe is certainly of a great concern to any of our nations which are threatened by Islamist terrorism, this is not a good reason to cancel the Visa Waiver Program. VWP actually promotes security through the information sharing arrangements and other security features I've talked about. By canceling or suspending it, not only would we have the immediate trade and economic harm that Secretary Chertoff mentioned, but we would also have less information available to us with which to make visa decisions and to watch out for suspected terrorists. So what should the U.S. do going forward? First of all, the U.S. should be always should be looking for ways to enhance information sharing arrangements, improve the type of information that we get off of ESTA forms, and make sure that we use the appropriate mechanisms to expand our ability to screen individuals and connect intelligence dots. These types of improvements do not require the chainsaw, they require the scalpel, and they can all be made within the existing program, and we don't need to cancel or suspend it. Second, the U.S. should be looking to judiciously expand the Visa Waiver Program. The more friends and allies that are contributing information on potential terrorists, the better able we are to look out for individuals who could be a threat to the United States. Expanding visa waiver would also allow us to better focus our finite visa and consular resources on other nations and individuals. The way to make this expansion happen is to replace the visa refusal rate, which I mentioned earlier, with something called the visa overstay rate, or use some combination of these metrics. The visa overstay rate is exactly what it sounds like. It's the percentage of people who we know overstay their visa when they come here to the United States. It's a better and more accurate metric for determining the immigration risk that someone poses to the United States. Using this better metric would allow more nations to join the Visa Waiver Program without threatening U.S. security or immigration procedures. It's worth mentioning that visa waiver reform and expansion, though, has gotten caught up in the contentious immigration debate. There's no reason why this common sense changes and reforms and expansion of this program should be held hostage to more controversial elements. Congress should really be considering Visa Waiver Program on its own merits, not on the merits of amnesty. So with all these benefits, the Visa Waiver Program is more valuable than ever. The threat of ISIS and radicalized Westerners is real, and the U.S. should be using all of its intelligence tools at its disposal to find and stop these terrorists. Visa Waiver Program is one of those tools, and to stop it now would make the U.S. less secure, less prosperous, and less engaged with friends and allies. Instead, we should be looking to improve and expand the program. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David. Adam?
Thank you. Good afternoon. As the head of a company that does economic analysis of the travel industry, I'll be taking a decidedly economic-centric view of this issue. The U.S. economy last year ran a trade deficit of $500 billion. Amidst this, one export sector stands out in contrast, and that is the travel sector. The travel sector in this context is an export because it's purchases of locally produced goods and services by foreign markets. That sector enjoyed an $80 billion surplus last year, well, through the 12 months through July. And the broader context of trade, as globalization has continued and manufacturing has shifted to low-cost areas of production, even though the U.S. has found key areas of manufacturing competitiveness, the travel sector continues to compete at the highest level across the board. Ultimately, it's in this sector that we see the United States as eminently competitive. Now, it's not just that we have a trade surplus of this $80 billion. Tourism is actually one of our largest exports, hands down. $180 billion spent in the country last year by foreign tourists. It compares as larger than auto and auto parts exports at $152 billion, or food and beverage products at $136 billion. Why? Why is the U.S. competing at such a high level? Well, as we work with clients around the world, tourism offices and governments on every continent, we see the way that they view the United States as a competitor. And their research, the research that we use in developing their tourism development strategies, shows that the U.S. is one of the most aspirational destinations in the world, showing up within the top 2 or 3 bucket list destinations for travel markets from everywhere that you'd want to attract this market. Now, if you want to put that into context, how good are we at this? That $180 billion that's spent in the U.S., that positions us as the #1 source of foreign visitor spending in the world. Who's number 2? It's Spain, and Spain is at just about 1/3 of that, at $60 billion. So that's how much better we happen to be at this in terms of competing. But there is nonetheless an enormously competitive global market. Yet somehow within the U.S. enjoys this intrinsic competitiveness, and it's fundamentally and say this with the view of the way that markets view us and the way that survey respondents talk about the U.S. and their experiences, is that the U.S. offers a product of diversity and quality with stunning beauty, myriad attractions, experiences, culture, and entertainment that is arguably unrivaled. And there's another reason, and it's the topic that we're discussing today, which is the Visa Waiver Program. It is a significant part of why the U.S. travel industry has been and is as successful as it is. If you want proof of this, let me share with you some case studies of what has happened when countries have entered into the Visa Waiver Program. So Taiwan was accepted in the fall of 2012. In 2013, visits from Taiwan to the United States increased 33%. And then in November 2008, under Secretary Chertoff, a number of countries were granted access. Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Republic of Korea. They met the criteria. Well, over the following 3-year period, the collective group of these markets increased 46%. So nearly 50% increase over that period of time. If you look at where they traveled elsewhere, well, maybe these markets were just growing at a faster rate. Actually, their travel to other parts of the world grew fractionally. If you want to look at specific countries within that group, South Korea, who joined in late 2008, grew 46% over the following 2 years. The Czech Republic grew 31% the year after, Hungary 15%, Slovakia 44%. Clearly, this program has a significant impact. Within the competitive environment, though, resting on our laurels, much less stepping backward is clearly a bad option. There is serious marketing and product development going on around the world to compete for these very visitors. The establishment of Brand USA to market the United States a couple of years ago has been a major step forward in being able to compete. But they're competing against a global budget of destinations marketing themselves that tallies $4 billion. So other destinations are competing very strongly. And though the tide has been turned over the last 2 years in terms of market share, if you look at since 2000, the United States has actually lost market share of global travel. It's lost market share from South America, from Europe, and from Asia. And some of the projects that we've been involved in as a firm have actually been helping governments around the world and consortiums of regional groupings of countries such as APEC, ASEAN, and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation look at how can they begin to adopt more sensible and inclusive travel facilitation policies, including visa waiver where appropriate, so that they can compete at a higher level. Now, other countries are certainly on this track. I mean, Canada allowed the Czech Republic to enter Canada visa waiver in 2007. Arrivals increased 36% to Canada from Czech Republic in the following years. Russia opened up to Hong Kong in 2009. Well, the volume of arrivals to Russian Federation from Hong Kong, China, jumped 184% in the following 3 years. So we can then, with this background, ask ourselves what would happen if the Visa Waiver Program were reversed or curtailed? Well, you could reasonably assume that it would be the opposite of the benefits that were realized when it was introduced. But there are also case studies of what has happened when countries have, perhaps ill-advisedly, restated visa requirements. And there are a few examples of this. Canada renewed the visa requirement on the Czech Republic in June of 2009. So after liberalizing for 2 years, they decided to reinstate that requirement. Well, arrivals over the next 3 years from the Czech Republic to Canada declined 70%. Canada also imposed a visa requirement on Mexico in June of 2009. And over the next 3 years, Mexican arrivals to Canada dropped nearly 50%. And then the UK, also another case study here, imposed visa requirements on South Africa in March of 2009. Then ensued a decline of 30% from that market. So the reality is, with this background, that visa requirements are fundamentally a self-imposed barrier to trade on our own economy. The Visa Waiver Program benefited 31% of our overseas visitors last year. Amazingly, even as these countries have been added over the last 5 or 6 years, the share of visa waiver countries that are represented in our total overseas volume has declined from 45% to where it now stands at 31%. And the reason for that is because emerging markets and high growth markets are the very ones that still require a visa. And requirements are still imposed where growth opportunities still remain to be the greatest: China, Brazil, India, Latin America, and Poland. So, in conclusion, there's no question that security must be paramount, but the need for security must not be seen, and is not, in conflict with the economic value and opportunity that the Visa Waiver Program affords us. So if it's in reference to trade shows, we assessed the market a few years ago for the Center for Exhibition Industry Research and found that about 2.5% of potential delegates, international delegates, to trade shows and exhibitions hosted here in the U.S. were refused entry. And that equated to, because of trade that takes place at these events, a loss of $2.5 billion. And then when it comes to leisure travel, when leisure visitors come, they experience the realities of the United States of America and not a caricature. So what this leads us to is the really unavoidable conclusion that investments in the Visa Waiver Program should be made to make it as inclusive and secure as possible. And those investments will pay massive dividends. Well, in my remarks, I've sort of unapologetically focused on the economics of this issue. But perhaps I'll end with a higher level of prose from one Mark Twain. Travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, and many of our people need it sorely on these accounts. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Adam. And now, appearing just at precisely the right moment is my esteemed colleague, Stuart Baker.
Who knew you need a visa to use Massachusetts Avenue, apparently.
All right. And we've talked security, we've talked economics. Now you get to wrap up the panel here.
Tell stories, hopefully. So the headlines about the possibility that people will be misusing Western passports are obviously quite pointed these days. And the risk of terrorists coming back from Syria and Iraq has never been more of a concern. And that led the UN Security Council to adopt a unanimous resolution, and it's not easy to get anything unanimously out of the Security Council, on terrorist travel, telling member countries to address foreign terrorist fighters by doing a variety of things, preventing suspected fighters from entering or transiting their territories, implementing legislation to prosecute foreign terrorist fighters, to undertake various steps to improve international cooperation, such as sharing information on criminal investigations, interdictions, and prosecutions. I dwell on that because that turned out to be a surprisingly easy thing to get international agreement on. And the reason it was surprisingly easy is that the United States, using its VWP leverage over the last 5 to 10 years, has more or less imposed those kinds of measures on our VWP counterparts around the world. So that we now have arrangements in which our VWP counterparts provide us with information that was never available before because we used the leverage of possibly withdrawing in whole or in part VWP status to get everybody to do things that they more or less agreed that was a good idea, but which they never would have done without something that drove them in the direction of actually doing it right now. One of the things that I think that we can be pleased about was the bipartisanship that we saw in 2006 between a deeply Democratic Congress and a President Bush, in which the 9/11 legislation was adopted, which set standards for what you have to do to be in the VWP, and where we were able to say we can expand the VWP, but at the same time set very high standards for security in the program and in connection with our counterparts abroad. That effort turned out to be remarkably successful. The combination of pressure about security inside the United States and the possibility that we would withdraw a VWP status from people who didn't, countries that did not cooperate, at the same time that we were demonstrating that we were committed to actually have a VWP program by opening the program to Eastern Europe, produced a consensus. Obviously, the people who are coming in new were deeply enthusiastic about pretty much anything that the U.S. asked them to do. Once they had signed on to all of these security measures, it became much more difficult for some of the countries where this was a bigger problem, either because they were less enthusiastic allies in the United States or they had a bigger Islamic population. In the long run, they had to come on board too. And so we now receive information about criminal convictions from all of these countries, which none of which gave it to us before. We also put in place a program of electronic, the European Commission, with whom I had I guess fraught is the nicest word for it, relationship, at one point said to me, well, this ESTA thing where people have to make reservations to come to the country and fill out all these forms in advance, and you might tell them yes and you might tell them no, even though we're a visa waiver country, this is like an electronic visa. And I said, wow, you broke the code. The fact is, what we have done is, in the ESTA program, is take advantage of the electronic capabilities that the communications that the internet makes possible, the background data processing that allows us to say, yes, we're open for business for 99.9% of everybody who wants to come here from these countries, and we'll tell you if you're in the 0.1% before you get on the plane. That ability to do that background check, even for people who in theory are coming here without a visa, has transformed our ability to protect the United States from occasional bad guys who are coming from countries that are basically allied with the United States. So when I hear people worrying out loud about the VWP, I can't help asking, compared to what? Because the alternative would be to go back to, I won't say the State Department is not in the 21st century, but they are struggling to provide the kind of background checks that are necessary for people who are coming from visa countries. And they are doing personal interviews, which have value, but the idea that we would do personal interviews for everybody in Great Britain or France who wants to come to the United States is a way of saying we really don't want anybody from France or the United Kingdom to come here. As you can imagine, if you had a choice of going on vacation in a place that required you to fly to Washington and be interviewed before you could come, and somebody that said, well, just get on the plane and fly here instead, most people would choose the easier route. So what we have done with the ESTA is made it much easier for people to go through the process. We are able to do deeper background analysis on those people because of the data we're getting from their home countries. We're not relying on our own list of people that we're worried about. We have the list from the folks who are closest to some of these movements in the country that the individuals are coming from. So it seems to me that rather than focusing on taking VWP away, we should be asking, what can we do, especially with a UN resolution that everybody signed on to, a Security Council resolution, what can we be doing to take those requirements and reinterpreting them in the context of a growing VWP to say, yeah, we are going to implement all of that as part of our Visa Waiver Program, and we're going to bring the rest of the developed world and some of the countries that want to be part of VWP along with us so we can get security and more travel at the same time.
Perfect. All right, microphone people, get ready. All right, we're ready to take questions for the panel. Okay, you get to go first again. Don't look over here.
Mr. Baker, can you, now wouldn't the people say these foreign fighters that are from France or the UK, we'll just use an example, go to Syria, train, come back, and they don't have any criminal record. They're a young man who's, you know, there's nothing there to let us know. I think that's a greater concern than people that are known criminals or that there's ties or something with their past, because it seems like these are a lot of very young men and might not have something that would be a red flag. What about that?
So first, there is a requirement in the Security Council resolution to actually prosecute people for doing that. We used to prosecute people all the time for violating the Logan Act or engaging in foreign wars. So that there's plenty of precedent for treating that as a crime. And the other point I would say is the French government, the UK government, is at least as scared of these people, and should be, as we are. It is not a given that they're coming back to France to buy tickets to New York. And so French intelligence, French law enforcement is going to be watching for these folks, trying to identify them and keep track of them. We do need, and we have pretty good, but I won't say perfect, exchanges of information about those folks. We now have a UN Security Council resolution that says you should be sharing information. We should take that and say, as part of our expectations with respect to VWP, we want you to be sharing that information, and we will share back to you the same kinds of information about Americans who have traveled to Syria for the same purpose.
All right, nope, right there.
Hi, Zoe O'Haron, Senate Judiciary Minority. So in the House hearing on September 10th discussing this Visa Waiver Program, Mr. Miller and Mr. Wagner from CBP said that 300 ESTA applications have been denied this year alone for security-related reasons, but 400 that were previously approved were later denied. Would you recommend expanding the data points that we're requesting from these countries? Because you had just said that we had told these countries that before their passengers get on the planes, we've already screened them and we've approved them, but more of them are being denied after the fact than before the fact.
Yeah, I think we should look hard at that. We should also look hard at expanding the kind of information we get from people so that we can do a better job of using our own intelligence capabilities to identify people who shouldn't be coming here. There are times when you say, okay, we want them to come here so we can arrest them, but those are rare. Absolutely, you know, the VWP gives us lots of leverage, but it's leverage you want to use sparingly because it's a little bit of mutual assured destruction. If you actually take somebody's visa waiver status away from them, it's going to hurt you as much as it hurts them. So what you need to do is find things like exchanges of information that most governments recognize they ought to be doing, but they need some incentive. They need to be able to say to the opposition, people who say, oh, don't share with any information with the Americans, they'll just send all these people to Guantanamo, which is, you know, what the usual rap is on the United States. They need to be able to say, well, we can't afford not to. We have a resolution, and we don't want to put visa waiver at risk. And so if you recognize your leverage and use it sparingly, you can get more information both from governments, and you can change the ESTA and start requiring more information.
I was just going to add to that, which is that as circumstances change, as CBP sees that it needs certain types of information, there's no reason to not look at changing the type of information that we ask for on ESTA. Threats change and the data points that we need might change, so that's something you should take a look at.
Other, in the back there.
Yes, thank you. Inga Johnny from Polish Press Agency. So as I understand, if you are from the country that is not a member of Visa Waiver Program, like from Poland, you have to go for the visa interview, and then, if you are lucky, you have a visa for 10 years. And then you can travel to US whenever you want without any procedure. And when you are a member of the country that is a member of Visa Waiver Program, you have to, each time when you want to go, you have to pass through this ESTA procedure and deliver in the information about you, yes? So in terms of security, actually, which system is better?
So it's a close call. You don't actually have to do ESTA every time. You do it once for a couple of years, usually. The main difference between the two is that there is an interview, but that could be a very short interview, and it doesn't necessarily produce a lot of information. To my mind, if the choice is between having good cooperation from the intelligence services and the interior ministries of a country so that they're actually telling you who they're worried about, and they know more about who's dangerous in their country than we do. If the choice is between that and being able to do interviews of people in that country, I'd take the data cooperation every time.
Also, just add to that, not only are there the information sharing and cooperation aspects, but there's also, we've talked a little about, budgets have come up a little bit here and there. The State Department only has so much money that it can spend looking at doing visa interviews and the such. If more people are part of the Visa Waiver Program, that means that the same number of visa consular officers are able to focus more intently on countries where we think that there are greater risks. So there's also security benefits from being able to shift toward higher risk targets.
Okay. That right there.
Thank you. I'm Dino Drudy, and I'm on the Board of Advisors for the Federation for American Immigration Reform. And I have two related questions. One is, if you waive people from having to have visas, how do you keep track of whether they overstay the visas they don't need? And the second related question is, if the United States is, in effect, a net benefactor from foreign travel, more people coming here than going someplace else, so we make $80 billion more. Why would a country which is having more of its residents go to the United States for business or pleasure than come from the United States to that country have any incentive whatsoever to facilitate and increase the incidence of that happening?
Let me try that one.
All right. I think all three of you may have comments on this.
That would be great. First, visa waiver doesn't mean you just don't come here without a visa and stay for as long as you want. It is really a visa. It's a 90-day visa, if I remember right. And if you stay to day 91, you're overstaying. We know you've come here because we've got your entry data. And unless you sort of do something weird like drive in and fly out, or fly in and drive out, we'll also have records that show you departing. So it's not at all impossible, although it's obviously a big data job, to match up the information on the manifest coming in and the information on the manifest coming out, which ought to be the same passport information, to see whether people came and stayed longer than they should have. Our usual approach for most people, and this by and large, has a pretty good disciplinary effect, is to say, if you overstay, you ain't coming back on the Visa Waiver Program. You're going to need to get a visa next time. And I vividly remember some poor woman from Iceland who came to the United States. I picture her as a matron in a nice sweater. She arrived and they said, 20 years ago, you overstayed your VWP status by 2 days. And she said, oh, well, I was in love, And they said, well, I'm sorry, we have to send you back because you don't have a visa. And before we send you back, of course, we have to keep you overnight because the next flight to Iceland isn't till tomorrow. And because of our standard procedures for dealing with people who are unlawful immigrants who have to be sent back, we're going to have to put you into detention. And because of our rules for how we do detention, we're going to have to shackle you arm and leg to ride in the bus. She will never forget, all of Iceland will never forget that experience. So there are ways of deterring that, but you also have a number of checks when people come in that allow you to do security checks on people on the way in. So I think there are mechanisms. We have a particularly, if there's a reason to be concerned about an overstay, there are folks at ICE who make it a priority to track down the people who are particularly raise concerns from a terrorism point of view. On the question of incentives, I'll try to be shorter. This is not just a calculation of, well, who's getting more money, who's got more tourists and richer tourists, and what's the net benefit. The real incentive here is that if you were a French official and you told the French public, by the way, I've screwed this up so badly that you're going to have to come to Paris and sit down in the embassy to go to Disneyland, you'd lose the next election. And the same would probably be true in the United States. It would be viewed as a major faux pas to have screwed up the relationship with Europe so that nobody could take their holidays in Europe without going through this. So both sides will feel enormous political pain from doing this, as opposed to saying, oh, I think I'm ahead of the game, so I'll go ahead and cut off VWP. I don't think it really works that way.
Yeah. And I think experience bears that out. I don't think there's no incident where someone's granted visa waiver to come to the U.S. and there hasn't been that reciprocity. Notwithstanding the fact that in most cases the U.S. on a net balance of trade would be the primary beneficiary. I think another interesting example right now is Brazil, because Brazil, which many within the U.S. travel industry would say should be a candidate for the Visa Waiver Program, actually requires a visa for U.S. travels to Brazil on the basis of reciprocity. It has nothing to do with security or overstaying issues. It's just the fact, well, you're going to require it of us, we're going to require it of you. And they would most gladly lift that visa requirement of American travels, even though Brazilian travel to the U.S., that demand is much, much greater than for American travel to Brazil.
And I would just add on the question of overstay, that's one of the reasons why at Heritage we recommend that we should move to a system which includes visa overstay. You're never going to stop every single person from overstaying their visa, but if you have a requirement that you have to have a visa overstay rate which is, say lower, say 3%, some a low visa overstay rate, then you are effectively looking for countries which are, their citizens already have good ties, they tend to go back, you're reducing your immigration risk there. So that's another reason why you could switch to a metric like that.
Okay, I'm going to have to cut off the questions so we can get to the ambassador. Please thank me, or join me in thanking the panel. And as they exit the stage, I will apologize ahead of time. As a guy whose name gets mispronounced quite often, I apologize ahead of time, Mr. Ambassador. But we now have Ambassador Richard Schniff. I apologize. See, it's a good thing I did it ahead of time. He is a longtime representative of the nation of Poland for their Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He has been the ambassador of Poland to Spain, most recently before this assignment, and is now the ambassador extraordinary and plenipotentiary of Poland to the United States. And please join me in welcoming him to our stage.
Good afternoon. We've been talking about Spain here, so I can confirm that the tourism is it's a great deal that Spain has enjoyed since many years, and thanks to the open policy to attract all the tourists. Let me start by thanking the Heritage Foundation for organizing this important event and for inviting me to have the last word, which, as you know, presents both an opportunity to leave a lasting mark, but also some additional pressure to deliver. I would like to thank also the panelists. I really enjoyed it. It was very instructive, very interesting, and particularly I agreed with the last opinions concerning that the cooperation between two countries, as far as the security is concerned, is much more important than the interview system that still is being applied in some cases. My mission reached its midterm surprisingly fast after 2 years' stay in Washington. Some journalists in Poland say I'm the most experienced member in the Polish Foreign Service, which is a subtle diplomatic way to remind me that retirement is on the horizon. But before one drives away into the sunset, one can have dreams. And mine is quite a simple one: to get rid of the last obstacle in US-Polish bilateral relations and get Poland to the Visa Waiver Program. Polish citizens deserve to feel welcomed when visiting the homeland of their friends and allies. A resolution once and for all to this issue should mean a lot to all of us. Having said that, I would like to draw your attention to a couple of important facts. And the first one is that despite not being in the VWP, Poland has fulfilled all the legal requirements demanded by the program. We have signed and abide by all bilateral security agreements that are needed to be a part of VWP. Second, we are one of the closest US allies in Europe. Polish soldiers have fought alongside their American colleagues in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we are part of the anti-ISIL coalition. Poles don't pose a terrorism threat to the United States. In fact, our attitudes toward terrorism and what is happening in the world today are in line with that of our American friends. Our cooperation as far as the security, as I mentioned, goes really far. And third, the hassle and embarrassment associated with having to stand in line to obtain a visa has turned many Polish businessmen and entrepreneurs to look for business opportunities elsewhere rather than the United States. When asked why, the reason is simple: the delays and hassle visa applications have on their business models. Finally, tourism, which you mentioned so frequently here, an area where the United States is missing out greatly. With 10 million Americans of Polish background, calling the US home, there's a plenty of places where Poles have a reason to visit. Yet in recent years, they prefer going to Disneyland in Paris rather than Disney World in Orlando or Los Angeles. Why? Simply because of the stigma associated with having to stand in line to ask for permission to travel to the United States. I think you will agree with me when I say that we are both losing out in the current environment, but no one more so than the United States. Not only is it missing out on tourism revenue, but more importantly, our relations miss out on the critical people-to-people contacts, the bedrock of our strong relations. Last week, Secretary of Commerce Penny Pritzker led an official business delegation to Poland to promote greater economic links between the countries. During the visit, she highlighted Poland's extraordinary political and economic transformation since the Cold War, what President Obama recently called, and I quote, an economic miracle on the Vistula. My country's incredible progress has placed Poland among the top 20 economies in the world, enabled Poland to avoid a broader European recession, and made Poland the sixth largest as well as the fastest growing economy in the European Union. As Secretary Pritzker stressed, this is part of the reason we have seen US-Poland commercial connections grow at such a rapid pace in recent years. Among the 100 largest US companies, 56 operate in Poland. More than 300 US companies are invested in Poland across all sectors, from retail to services to manufacturing, with a total investment of over 30 billion over the last 2 decades. At the same time, Polish companies invested $500 million of US dollars in the United States only last year. I stand here before you to make it clear that these numbers can and should be greater. The VWP expansion is essential in allowing for this to take place. Over the past 2 years, my staff and I have worked closely with our friends in the administration and on Capitol Hill to get Poland into the Visa Waiver Program. The JOLT Act, a bill that would pave the way for Poland and other allies to enter the program, has passed in the Senate earlier this year. The House version in turn has 165 co-sponsors from both sides of the aisle. But the House version has been stalled for months. I know. I speak for many when I say that we want this bill to see the light of the day and be placed on the House floor for a vote. As all indications suggest, this is broad bipartisan support that would lead to its passage in the House. Let me conclude by thanking and applauding the Heritage Foundation for the ongoing support for Visa Waiver Program expansion over the years, and encourage our business friends, those who are already heavily invested in Poland, as well as those who are just tapping into the opportunities our marketplace provides, to contact members in the House, but especially the House leadership and members of the Judiciary Committee, to underline the importance of Poland's inclusion to this program. The JOLT Act is a great starting point. As far as I am concerned, why wait for the new Congress to be sworn in next year and allow 2 years of hard work to be lost when Congress can get this done during the lame duck session? US jobs depend on it. Our collective security depends on it, and transatlantic relations depend on it. So I remain hopeful the House acts, then Congress follows suit, and then that this bill reaches the President's desk. And I'm counting on your support. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, I have to say, as a member of our military who fought next to your men and women, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, I thank you, and I thank you for the continued friendship that was there before you became a formal ally until now. And we at Heritage stay firmly behind the getting your country into the Visa Waiver Program and hopefully expanding it further. Thank you. I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. Hopefully we've increased an understanding of the Visa Waiver Program, and I will put out an invitation to those of you in the press and those of you from over on the Hill. If your members have questions about Visa Waiver and why we support it staying in place and actually expanding during this time rather than trying to get it to recede, we'd be happy to chat with you and give you those reasons in even more depth than were elaborated on here. We think it's very important for the security of the United States and for our relations with our friends and allies that we do this. And with that, I thank all of you that are here, those of you that are online and with us through C-SPAN, and we wish you a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.